to us today. As a starter, I just wanted to take you back to what is now almost 10 years from when the SDC published as a report your report, Prosperity Without Growth. I was just wondering, going back then, the talk was that it was quite controversial around government. What was the issues? What was the sensitive issues? What were the bits that you had to fight most to keep in that initial report?
Well, it was a very interesting process. I mean, we didn't fight that much before the report itself. When I was drafting the report, basically we took every chapter periodically to an advisory group of representatives from across the government, so from Treasury, from DEFRA, from business. You know, we had all those people in the room. There were tricky moments, like when we had announced that we were going to do this inquiry into growth and sustainability, and I remember distinctly one meeting where a Treasury official stood up after I'd given the presentation and said, basically, so sustainability, that's really about going back to live in caves. Is that what you mean? And all I had really done at that point was to say, you know, there is a de facto question about an increasing economy on a finite planet, but it was seen as being, you know, so there was definitely rumblings in the background which suggested that this was a slightly dangerous thing to do, and our relationship, which was with DEFRA as our sponsoring department, was very careful that we did all this, you know, sounding out the messages with the right people before the report, right down actually to going to advisors at Number 10 to ask if it would be okay for us to have this title, Prosperity Without Growth. And you know, getting an answer back which in retrospect was a little bit ambiguous, which said, I don't think it matters what you call it. we took to mean that, okay, we'll go with Prosperity Without Growth. So we will put a question mark at the end of it because we don't want to, you know, rattle the cage too much. It's very much an invitation to a conversation. Is it possible to have prosperity in a non-growing economy? And then actually at the time that the report was launched, which was the end of March 2009, actually, so it's 9 years ago.
Yeah.
It just happened to coincide with the G20 meeting in London, just after the financial crisis.
Yes, right.
So the Prime Minister had obviously, you know, drawn the leaders of the world together at that point to kickstart growth. So when this report landed the week before on his table, him having presumably not spoken to the advisor who advised us, it didn't matter what we called it. There was a quite fierce reaction. There was, and that fierce reaction maintained a kind of almost radio silence between us as the Commission and the government in relation to that particular conversation. So it didn't do the job that a government commission's report should do, which is in terms of advising its government. It turned out to do a completely different job, which was much broader in scope, appealed to a much wider audience, suddenly became sort of viral through the internet, rather than being a commission advising its government. And we had very little of that conversation actually at that time. It was an incredibly difficult period. It was that relationship became problematic partly because of the existence of that report.
So they froze you out, or they just did not respond. They did not comment. They pretended the report didn't exist.
Not entirely, but that was the gist of it. Really, that was the gist of it. There were certain places where, for example, in relation to that, and another actually at the end of my time as a commissioner, where I got a letter from Number 10 thanking me for the good work that I had done advising the government on prosperity and growth. So there was elements of, we recognise that this is there.
They thanked you for advising them on prosperity and growth.
Yeah. So that was good to know. But it was it was a difficult kind of message for government, particularly at that time, I think. And in retrospect, I kind of sometimes I'm stunned by our naivety in thinking that we could just write that report in that way with that title and expect government to act differently.
So do you think, I mean, did that actually partly lead to the demise of the SDC, do you think?
That's an open question. I mean, it's a really tricky question, because certainly for my fellow commissioners, because, and indeed for the existence of such a commission, because if that were the case, then I would have to accept some responsibility for the demise of a really useful institution and the loss of the posts of all those other commissions. I think in a way it's a little bit kind of just assigning too much importance to that one thing. I mean, the commission was set alight in a bonfire of quangos in the wake of an understanding that we couldn't, what we believed was an understanding that we had to cut back public spending by getting rid of all these bodies which were sitting there somehow in an undemocratic way. I'm not using that term myself, but that was used at the time.
And I suppose also you had the Climate Change Commission that was then set up as a potential competitor.
The Climate Change Commission was being set up under the Climate Change Act. That was clearly an important thing to have, and it did overlap to some extent with the remit of the Commission, not on this particular issue perhaps, but on some of the work that we were doing.
So Tim, in terms of thinking about what this Plan B would look like, you published a revised version of Prosperity Without Growth in 2017. What was the thinking behind that, and what extra does that bring to the story to maybe crack this sort of Plan B challenge?
Yeah, it was a kind of interesting decision, really. I mean, when the publishers sort of first were saying, maybe think about a re-edition of the book, my first thought was, well, it is a long time ago. A lot of the evidence that I brought to bear may have changed. Maybe I should update a few graphs and change some numbers in the text, and that's what I started doing with the revision. And then I began to read it, and two or three things struck me, I suppose. One was that the context had changed. We really did think back then that we would kickstart growth, and we didn't in quite the same way. We were very, very different circumstances, and the political change, the change through, first of all, we could stimulate and we'd get growth back, didn't work, or we doubled our national debt in the space of 3 years. Second, we then had to do austerity to get growth back. Didn't work, and worse still, we alienated half the population and withdrew the social safety net from the poorest in society. And third of all, this idea, actually, that the trend of declining growth rate was nothing to do with the financial crisis. It actually started back in the 1960s and 1970s. The financial crisis arose because we kept trying to push growth in the context of a declining background growth rate. It's a very, very different kind of story from the one that was on the surface just after the crisis. So it's not that we've been trying to get over the crisis. The crisis was a signifier, actually, that we had been pushing an over-financialized economy, and the reason we'd been doing that was essentially this determination to have growth squeezed out of it somehow, even though labour productivity, for example, had declined systematically from the mid-1960s onwards. So we've got a declining labour productivity growth, and we've got a policy that's insistent on having growth out of it. You've got to get that somehow. If you do it by stimulus, you risk the inflation of the 1970s. If you do it by financialization, you risk what we saw in the last decades, which was increasing inequality, hyper-financialization, an over-consumerized society, an increasingly unstable financial system. So the financial crisis was not the cause, but a symptom of the declining growth.
So your new book brought this out? And what, I mean, in terms
that
of
was
sort
one
of
of the things it
solutions
did.
or proposals?
Yeah,
Or...
that was the first thing that after I realised I couldn't just update the graph and change the numbers, was this the story was different. Our understanding of it was deeper, and that had happened because of the financial crisis. The first book more or less coincided with that crisis. It couldn't really write about it in the same way or think about it in the same way. But the second realisation I had as I read it in the context of the last few years, the years since the original report, was it had always puzzled me that when people read the book, they saw the critique of the growth-based system, but they didn't see that I was attempting, at least, to say there are some ways out of this.
Yeah.
There's a different way to think about the economy. You can think about the different elements of it in ways which are potentially offering you all of these opportunities to do something slightly differently. And I mean, it is partly because the book is often reduced to its title, and the title of this one is quite provocative, and therefore people, had a sort of tendency just to think of prosperity without growth. Some of them probably hadn't read the book at all, and but had read the title, or had
yes.
at least heard of the title.
Yeah.
So they knew that Tim Jackson was really just talking about getting rid of a growth-based economy. That's nuts. So we don't have to listen to that anymore.
But they didn't pick up on the prosperity bit, which is quite interesting.
Particularly
isn't it?
pick up on the
What does
prosperity,
that mean?
or indeed the chapters which talked about how you could deliver it, the government policies that might help, the way in which you would think differently about industrial structure and about investment. So there were lots of things that kind of and I was surprised even by some of my more sympathetic readers, that they would sometimes sort of say, well, the analysis the logic is faultless, but the policies are impossible, or something like this, which somebody from the Welsh Assembly government said to me at one point. But when I reread it, I could sort of see that I hadn't made the narrative clear enough. So what I wanted to do in the second book very specifically was make that narrative structure very, very clear from analysis to prescription, and to tease out the different elements of that prescription. So I ended up framing the second book around the idea that four elements of the economy require a kind of transformation. So enterprise and the nature of enterprise on the one hand, work, and that has become a sort of increasingly important conversation at the moment in terms of the future of work.
Yeah.
Investment as a kind of relationship between the present and the future, because what we invest in matters, and being able to see that actually the financial crisis was to some extent a realization that we turned investment into a gambling casino. And then the nature of the money system itself, which was something that came actually out of subsequent conversations. It wasn't in the original book at all.
Yeah.
And so what I did in the second book, I wanted to do very specifically, was to build these as foundations, as conceptual foundations. Say, the language of economics still matters. Thinking systematically about economics still matters. But we've somehow got to revision these four basic concepts: enterprise, work, investment, money, and put them to the service of a good society.
So it's about purpose and rethinking the way we organise our economy.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And actually also pointing out that those are very practical things with pragmatic steps that you can, and actually one of the interesting things is that they had already been happening in the 9 years since the report was already published. So I could draw on, lots of lovely examples of ways in which enterprise or investment or even the money system was being changed by people in response to the needs for a better, stronger economy.
And what were these sort of practical policies that people find unacceptable or too radical or whatever? What give me a couple?
So actually, interestingly, the policies that were in there were in everything which, from the very, very conventional strands of things like carbon taxes or internalizing externalities sits absolutely within the remit, to things like universal basic income, which is increasingly talked about as a way of redistributing, particularly in a world where work may be harder to get or jobs are less secure, and social services have no clear funding base. Then the idea of a universal basic income becomes very important. I didn't dwell on individual policies, but in the second edition, but I was very concerned to sort of say, first of all, that to really sketch out the ways in which enterprise could be thought of differently. And I focused in enterprise, for example, on the transition from an industrial structure which we had in the past, which was very much linear. From you dig stuff out of the ground, you make lots of products, you increasingly diversify these products, you sell them, but you don't want people to keep them for too long because you want them to go on buying the next one, so they have to throw them away. So this very linear, materialized economy. And using that definition of prosperity that underlies the book, said, what does prosperity really mean about enterprise? Is enterprise really about that linear production chain, or is it something to do with providing the services that contribute to the quality of our life? And if it perhaps means the latter, what might those services be? And then what might be the challenge of providing those services? And what might be the organizational forms of enterprise that best deliver those services? And that this way of thinking about enterprise as a foundation of the economy opens up a whole flight path, if you like, of possibilities for doing enterprise differently. And some of that is already being explored in the social enterprise sector. Some of it's being explored by more progressive mainstream companies. Some of it is being explored through different ways of private-public partnership. And some of those experiments are very, very small, but they give us a kind of new world.
So, is that would you say, like John McDonnell's idea of cooperatives taking a role in the provision of utilities, as sort of something that's picking up?
I love that. The fact that it's John McDonnell's idea. That's
well, he's talking. I'm sure it's not his idea, but he at least has said it.
Yeah, but I think in a way that's a part of where the work is done. I'm not sure what. I guess Ed Mayo would be delighted to hear that it's John McDonnell's idea that co-ops should play some part in the organisation of services. What it says is actually that there's been a kind of mainstreaming of that idea that the forms of enterprise that could play a part in the delivery of an economy that works for everyone. And Labour also used that language, interestingly. An economy for the many, not the few, is the variation on it. But that John McDonnell is now beginning to say things like that is absolutely a part of that journey of rethinking how enterprise works. I mean, it is quite radical what the Labour Party is now proposing, and what's interesting about it is how much of an ideological transition has occurred over that decade. Because back in the day, even in 2007, with a much more open government which thought it could have these interesting conversations, actually, it was still very much the ideology that the market knows best and that the state must work with the market in providing even things which are public and common goods.
Yeah.
And the shift, the ideological shift that has put in the foreground the idea that relationship could be different, that actually the state can and should be taking a role in the provision of those goods, and that the private sector, the potential damage that the private sector can do, which wasn't obvious back in 2007, 2008, has become obvious now through the failures of not just the financial sector, but more recently Carillion and the provision of services and the private finance initiative. And this general understanding that has arisen that actually a lot of that old ideology was about the privatization of benefit and the socialization of cost,
Yeah.
and that this is deeply iniquitous. And so these things have come through in the last decade through our understandings of what's happened in ways that have shifted the ideological ground, and that's an opportunity really to rethink. I would like to think even that this government that we have would be capable of doing some of that rethinking, and I've spoken to people within various departments who are quite sympathetic to that rethinking, were it not for the other political priorities that occupy rather a lot of government time.
So
at the moment, I can't see a commission that would be in the process of, or in the space where it could dare to put forward a report like that. So I do think the context has changed, and I think in a way it was very sad. I don't put it down specifically to that context, that prime minister, that time. I put it down to a more general difficulty that government has to address this most crucial issue. What does the economy look like and what's it for? Interestingly, now we have a prime minister who stood on the steps of Downing Street and said, I'm going to change things. I'm going to create an economy that works for everyone. And, she borrowed that language actually from some of the people that we work directly with on exactly these issues of questioning the economy, questioning the basis of the economy, and trying to make it work differently. So in principle, there should be a more receptive ear than there was at that particular time and context. But I still find it. I still find you can have some of that conversation with government. What should an economy look like, particularly when it's working for everyone? Perhaps when it's working in difficult financial or economic circumstances. But as soon as you pitch that in a very precise way around growth, that's when the conversation becomes much more difficult. And that's been true of most governments over the last half century, 60, 70 years. So it wasn't about Gordon Brown at that time, but clearly that it was interesting in a way, because one of our advices from Treasury at that time was, I think this might be the time at which you could begin to raise this difficult question. This was 2007 when we were thinking about it, because we've basically got growth fixed.
Sorted that. So now we could question whether we need it.
Now we can ask these more difficult questions and think about these wonderful things like sustainability. And it was the same year in which Gordon Brown said we have the longest period of sustained economic growth in 200 years. And it was just, it was extraordinary, really, in terms of the hubris involved in that situation. And I think one of the most interesting things in the 10 years since then is that hubris has been challenged, increasingly, as has the idea that a growth-based economy and a growth-based economics is ours as a right. We've actually now, even in the mainstream economics, begun to come round to the possibility that a low growth or even no growth environment could be a new normal. It's not a comfortable one. Politicians are no happier with it now than they were before, but actually very mainstream people are talking about it.
But if it is the inevitable, or we can't avoid it, then giving politicians something to sell it with, of course, they'd have to be totally changing their messages and changing how they're talking, wouldn't they?
Well, that's right. I mean, first of all, you've got to get off your sort of addiction to the G word in a way. And actually, I think that's quite an interesting strategy. It's when I work with people who sort of say to me, look, my context is one in which I can't challenge growth in this way because it's just a given. So, in the financial sector, in investment sector, in policy, in all sorts of places where there's an understanding that growth comes before everything, and that when you make a speech, you pay homage to that word.
Yeah.
And when you talk about strategy, you introduce how it's going to help you with growth. There was a point during Cameron's government where he just stood up and said, I'm putting my cabinet on a war footing, and every minister is going to be a minister for growth.
Yeah.
And literally laying it out as a kind of campaign strategy, without ever really questioning either the feasibility or the legitimacy of that. I think that's shifted very subtly because of these arguments coming from the mainstream that actually growth may not be there in the way that we hoped it was or hoped it would be over the last few decades. And that's a point at which, as you say, you actually have to have a kind of a plan B. Okay, so is it going to be there? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So what's my first job? Maybe my first job is to not be so actually tied into this growth-based idea that I can't let a sentence go by without installing the word growth in it, and just start to nuance that language. And this is what I say to some of these advisors. Look, okay, so you're in that situation, but do you always have to talk about it's going to contribute to growth, or could you perhaps talk about it contributing to an economy that works for everyone, or a more successful economy, or to prosperity across regions, across different parts of the country? Could you use language which doesn't necessarily install the G word at every sentence? And that to me is a shift. That's a kind of different way of approaching the conversation.
And are there any politicians that are picking this up?
Yeah, a little bit. I think they are. I think in a way, even the language of an economy that works for everyone is a different kind of language from the continual pushing of the growth message, which happened very much in the last administration. I think that actually some of what McDonnell says is sometimes questioning of that growth paradigm. So actually, that's very cross-party already. You have the Tories and Labour both, to some extent, being prepared not simply to repeat that mantra as though it will solve every problem. What we don't have yet is somebody seriously prepared to say, actually, we may not have this growth-based economy, so we better start working out what it looks like when we don't get it. And that's, that to me, I used after Prosperity Without Growth was published, and I was doing this kind of round the departments talking about it thing. I would occasionally go, for example, to the Treasury, and I would say, look, I understand all your mainstream models are based around growth. I understand this is important for employment, for security, for debt, for public financing, etc. But couldn't you have just a small corner of the Treasury in which there was somebody working on Plan B? Because actually, this stuff may not work out the way you think it's going to work out at the moment. And I think the interesting thing about the last 10 years is it's kind of shown that in a way. We thought we'd kickstart the economy in April 2009. And here we are, 9 years later almost, and we still haven't quite got back the economy, the growth-based economy that we thought we would get by kickstarting growth in April 2009.
Environmental movement perspective, I suppose. Strategically, I suppose a lot of people in the environment movement might feel under attack from the likes of Trump and taking away regulation, the sort of Brexit agenda of deregulation. But do you think there's also a sort of positive, optimistic, and actually a potential for change? And if there is, what should the environment movement be doing to actually make that happen?
Yeah, it is strange. It is strange because what we've seen is a sort of a twin track process. On the one hand, which is mainstream politics, I think we have to say, we've seen this kind of fracturing of public trust. We've seen enormous discontent from communities that have been left behind, and that has given rise to uncomfortable political populisms that to some extent have led to things like Brexit and Trump. And that's been about to me, the failure of an ideological position, both in relation to growth and in relation to the ideology of the market, which have increasingly it's kind of like they've created a kind of brittle society, really. I think in political and in social terms, and a society in which you can measure the increasing inequality, a society in which you can see long-term underinvestment particularly in the poorest sectors of society, and in which you in which is also subject to a renewal of a kind of an ideological strengthening of a very conservative position, which is prepared to basically tell lies in order to exploit what is happening at the more popular level. So the idea that the people who are now leading these changes, these political changes, alt-right political changes, are really speaking for the place that they took their mandate is a complete anathema. It's nonsense that the Brexiteers in this country are really speaking for those who voted for Brexit because they had been excluded from political, social, even from livelihoods over such a long time. Those people are not speaking for that.
Given the alt-right is in the wrong place, what is the right place for the environmental sustainability movement to be in, to actually, out of this crisis, if you like, of sort of the past ideology, to create something new and a positive future?
I think the negativity of the analysis through the alt-right is only half of the picture. I think the other half of the picture is to realise that that the actual mandate is not to create alt-right nationalistic visions that protect the interests of capital over everything and push for growth, but actually to begin to build this vision of a different kind of economy. So to look at, almost from a needs-based perspective, what it is that went missing in those communities that were economically and socially left behind and politically left behind, to understand that actually the basis of our prosperity, to go back to the very the fundamental thesis, is not simply about material affluence and even about income growth. It is rather about security, yes, for sure, about community, about friendship, about family. It's about a sense of meaning and purpose. It's about participation in society, and those are the things that went missing. And so in a sense, I think the task for advocates of sustainability and advocates of change, particularly coming from an environmental side, is as much as it ever was critiquing a system that has undermined both people and planet over a long time, yes, for sure, and recognizing that we're still living in that very destructive system, almost magnified by alt-right, and yet at the same time beginning to build this vision of what a society could look like if it were different, if it were inclusive.
But I suppose the thing is, one problem might be with the environmental movement is, to some extent, they got on board with the previous ideology, didn't they? They bought into the market solutions, market instruments, and for a lot of the people who are dissatisfied with it, the environmental movement might be seen part of the problem.
They may well be, and in some ways there would be evidence. I mean, there was evidence really in the early days of the STC report. It was very interesting. The people who were most nervous about it after the government for whom it was written were the environmental groups. So I was called in. I was called into all sorts of places. Investment banks, literary groups, theatres, book festivals, various sectors of the engineering profession, who were all absolutely up for this conversation about whether growth could go on forever on a finite planet. And the two sectors that were much less anxious to engage in that conversation, even one was the political people for whom we wrote the report, the government itself, and the other was the environmental groups. And I was part of that movement, actually, that environmental movement that in the 1990s, for example, when we wrote a report about climate change, would constantly be saying things like, don't be silly, we have this technological efficiency advantage, we can achieve this without challenging growth. Sometimes we'd even write growth targets into our reports to show that you could still meet them while meeting the sustainability challenge. And that a movement of the environmental movement itself towards the establishment was one of the gains of that new Labour opening out of government, sort of almost glasnost in our own context of bringing in the NGOs, bringing in the environmental lobbies into government, giving them a voice, allowing them to play the game alongside the big boys, and none of the environmental groups wanted to give that up.
But they had to be seen to be serious and play it in a certain way. So do these green groups now have to do a mea culpa to some extent and say, maybe we need to rethink where we are and our positioning, and accept that maybe what we've done in the past in terms of getting into bed with a particular market-driven ideology was a mistake?
I'm not sure how important it is to fess up to that, because it's not a huge crime when you think about it. I mean,
well, is it? Well,
maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mean, I know, partly because I was there doing it alongside that for certain parts of my career. I know that what you're doing in that situation is your voice is useless if it isn't going to be heard anywhere. So you better make sure that you at least speak the language of those who you want to hear your words. And so, there was an element of necessity in that. But I do think it's time to recognise that dynamic is not always in the best interests of the campaign that you're working towards. And actually the long-term campaign may just be in a different place.
And is it the green groups, do you think, taking on that message and actually rethinking where they are, or are they stuck really and just in shock at what's has happened?
I think the one good thing really about environmental lobbies, lobby campaigns generally, is that they engage in a lot of self-reflection. So it was slow at first, but actually then I did sit down with across the board from development campaigners to climate change campaigners to poverty campaigners, and actually had very constructive conversations about that, and during those conversations I think what emerged really was those groups recognizing that they were in a difficult position. It's a sort of classic exit versus voice situation. If you take the language from investment, do you just disinvest from something which you think is a crap process or a crap stock, or do you stay engaged so that your voice can be heard and you can make the changes that would make things better,
even if they're marginal, I suppose?
Well, if then it's a much trickier conversation, because if you can see yourself as making marginal changes, you can still convince yourself that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, the easiest one is where you can see, well, we're not even making marginal changes, so we might as well
move
trash
on to
the system and do something completely radical, which some people obviously do. Some groups do.
And there's the degrowth movement, isn't there, which doesn't seem to be big in the UK, but in Europe seems to be bigger, as far as I understand. Yeah,
degrowth was interesting because it kind of came up around about the same time as these conversations, over the same sort of time period, and particularly from continental Europe. It came from slightly different sort of, slightly more intellectual basis, actually, in a way. It came from sort of social sciences, particularly in France and Spain, and then increasingly a little bit, at least a little bit in Germany. It's slightly different in Germany. More critical of an Anglo-American or Anglo-centric neoliberal market in the first place.
Yes.
And beginning to say, actually, maybe there's a different kind of way of approaching these issues. And what's interesting about the degrowth movement is it has approached many of these issues, although from a slightly different angle, and become a sort of critical voice that's allowed itself to congregate around this degrowth terminology, which is always going to put it in a critical position.
Yes.
And it's one of the problems of the movement, as well as one of its advantages. Its advantages that it attracts people who are critical to this existing system and therefore want a banner under which to convene. And it's problematic because it becomes incredibly difficult to have a conversation between the concept of degrowth and the concept of an ideologically driven growth-based economics.
So finally, do you feel positive overall that there's a movement for change that's possible here, or do you think the forces of reaction are going to be too strong?
I mean, the forces of reaction are going to be very strong, and there is a possibility for change. And in a way, you never know the outcome of those things until you've engaged in the struggle. And so the question is it worth engaging in the struggle? And to me, the answer to that is always yes, because what's at stake here is actually, not just do we meet our Paris goals, but actually the nature of the society and the nature of the economy that we want to be, and how we see human progress. And ultimately, I think personally for myself, I see human progress as about the betterment of the human spirit, the increase in our creativity, as well as just our ability to flourish and thrive in material terms. And therefore this battle or struggle is a struggle worth engaging in for those reasons.
Thank you very much, Tim.